Hold on. And Parshas Vayera begins with Avraham. 3 days after his circumcision, Almighty God comes to visit him. And Rashi says something so beautiful, that God is visiting someone who's unwell, that not only God tells us which mitzvahs to do, God himself or God herself, God's self does all the mitzvahs that he tells us to do. So it's a mitzvah to visit somebody who's sick. God is visiting Abraham, paying him a social call, which is so interesting. One commentary said something so beautiful. Why do we visit someone who's unwell? Because there's a certain relief and good feeling for the person who's ill when they have a visitor. Makes them feel, at least for a few minutes, you forget your krechts, you forget your pain, you forget your illness, because you have people keeping you busy, keeping you entertained. So my brother just shared with me a magnificent story, which I feel I really want to share. He heard from his fellow friend who's a rabbi in Fort Lauderdale, a Chabad rabbi, and this guy, I think his name is Rabbi Halsband, was new in town, and he's trying to find Jews. It was right before Passover, so he packed up shmora matzah, and he went to this Jewish doctor in town, and he gave the doctor a box of matzah, and the doctor says, I don't have time to chat, but in the waiting room, I think one of my patients is also Jewish. So he goes over to this lady in the waiting room, and he says, hello, I'm the rabbi here. Can I give you a box of matzah for Passover? She says, no, I'm Jewish, but I don't believe in organized religion. I don't practice Passover. I don't need matzah. He says, it's free. She says, no, thank you. Keep the matzah for yourself. So he pulls out a business card, and he says to her, if you ever need a rabbi or you need anything, call me. Here's my card. So she snatches it out, and he leaves. Few months go by, the phone rings, and the lady on the other line says, Rabbi, I don't know if you remember me. I was the nasty lady in the waiting room. My father was told he's passing away within 48 hours, and he asked for a rabbi. Now, we never practiced Judaism. We never even went to Shul or Yom Kippur. We have nothing to do with our Jewish faith. But could you come? He said, of course. He comes to the hospital, and the father tells the two daughters, because there's two daughters, leave. I want to speak to the rabbi. Good morning, Michelle. Good morning. I'm telling a story about circumcision because we opened up the Torah portion with Abraham, who's 99, gets circumcised. So the guy says to the rabbi from Fort Lauderdale, Rabbi, I'm going to pass away in 2 days. The doctor said, my life is over. And I've had a very good life, he says to the rabbi. I was very successful. I have 2 beautiful daughters. I lived a beautiful life. But when the doctor told me I have only 2 more days to live, I realized there's one thing I didn't accumulate in my life. Any Judaism. He said, I lived my entire life disconnected from my Jewish faith, my Jewish soul. I have nothing to do with it. He said, and now I'm thinking my soul is going to go back up to the heavens, metaphorically speaking, and I'm not bringing anything with me. Absolutely nothing. So, Rabbi, do me a favor, get me a circumcision. Close the door and circumcise me. So the rabbi says, Ronnie, with all due respect, I'm a rabbi, but I'm not a mile. He thought every rabbi is a mile. A mile means a circumciser. He says, Rabbi, if you're not a mile, I want you to get me a mile right now. I am not dying without a circumcision. Now the nurse came in to take his blood pressure, and she overhears this conversation, and she goes out to the 2 daughters and says, I don't know if you realize it, your father just asked that rabbi to circumcise him. And the daughters come marching in, Rabbi, leave this room, you're insane, leave my father alone, we're not circumcising my father. The old man begs the Rabbi, please, 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 please. So the rabbi runs to the head of the hospital and tells him the story, And the head of the hospital said, I'll give you permission to have a circumcision if you bring me a Moel who's also an MD and has practicing privileges in this hospital. And he can't find anybody. But he remembers that he has a friend who's a doctor in New York. So he calls up his friend, who's also a Moel and an MD, and he tells him the whole story. He says, get me on a flight, I'll be there. They gave him privileges for the hospital, and he circumcised Ronnie. And guess what? Ronnie did not pass away 2 days later. He lived much longer. And then he told the rabbi before he passed away, I want to be buried like a Jew. And the rabbi promised him. He passes away, and his daughters say, we're cremating him. You know, according to Jewish faith, we don't cremate because the body is sacred. So the rabbi says, no, your father just had a circumcision. How could you cremate him, please? They said, listen, we don't have money for burial. One daughter gave $1,000, one daughter gave $600. Do with it what you want. We are not paying for his burial. The rest of the burial was $9,000. The rabbi didn't have any money. He took his credit card. He got the burial done, and Ronnie was buried, circumcised as a Jew. But now I want to give you the end of the story, which is unbelievable. Time goes by, and he brings a new Torah into his congregation. And a few weeks later, he gets an envelope, and he gets a letter. She says, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Ronnie's daughter. I was at the Torah celebration. My friend invited me. I was so inspired that I want to bar mitzvah my son and attached his $9,000 to pay you back for the money you laid out for my father's funeral. Why am I sharing this story? Because you never know what spiritual sparks will be triggered. A circumcision, you say, what's the big deal? So he wasn't circumcised. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, even if you're not circumcised. But look what happens at the last minute. Ronnie gets circumcised, and it triggers a whole series of events. And he ends up having his daughter now bar mitzvahing her son the proper way and reconnecting. So Abram circumcises himself at 99 years old. Normally we circumcise a child at 8 days old. And God, as I mentioned, visits Abraham. And they're having a conversation. And suddenly, Abram spies 3 people walking towards his tent. Now, we all know that Abraham and Sarah's mission statement was hospitality. Whenever they saw people, they would invite them into their massive tent, which was like a mansion. They would give them food and water and chat. And then they would say to them, make a blessing and thank God. Who's God? God, the creator of the universe. I don't believe in that. Okay, so pay me for the food. $10,000. Oh, no, I don't want to pay for the food. So then bless God. So they would bless God. And that's how Avram and Sarah brought people closer to belief in one God. So 3 angels who are disguised as men are coming towards Avram's tent. So Avram gets up, says to God, one moment, God, I'm having guests coming to my tent. So the commentaries say, even greater than welcoming God into your home, so to speak, is the mitzvah of having people over, guests, hospitality, graciousness, kindness, goodness. Yoitzer mikabalus pnei hashchina, it's greater to be hospitable, kind, and good than even to welcome God into your tent. So this is such a beautiful insight about Abraham. Now, Avram and Sarah have 3 guests who are angels, and they begin prepping food, and they begin bringing out goodies. And the angels are stupefied by this whole scenario. When God said to the 3 angels, go to the tent of Abraham, why did God send the 3 angels to the tent? Anybody remember the story? Each angel had one mission. One was to tell Abraham and Sarah they're going to have a child in their old age. The second angel was there to heal Abraham from the circumcision. And the third angel was there to tell Abraham and Sarah that the Sodom and the 5 cities of Sodom are going to be annihilated because the people there are cruel and immoral people. So there's 3 angels. You know, angels can only have one mission. They're not like human beings. So every angel was there to tell Avram and Sarah one thing and accomplish one mission. Now, when the angels were sent, the Kabbalah says a very beautiful insight here. They were so excited. Why? They were finally going to meet the celebrities. Avram and Sarah. They were going to finally meet all these famous couple. Every time God is talking about Avram and Sarah this and Avram and Sarah that. And all the angels are like, what's so great about these human beings? These human beings with all their fallacies and their insecurities. Why is God, what's the whole ruckus about Avram and Sarah? So when God sends down these 3 angels, they can't wait to meet these 2 famous celebrities. Wow. We're going to see an aura of light. We're going to see a halo. We're going to see these 2 amazing people. So the angels come in the tent.
Torah class.
And what do they see? They see a guy going to, he's setting up a barbecue station, his Weber grill. He's preparing food. He's in the kitchen. Sarah's baking cake. And then Avram is bringing water, and Avram is giving them drinks. And he says, till the grill is ready, here's cheese with a little bit crackers. Munch till I'm ready. So the angels look at each other. This is the Avram God is talking about? A butcher? A chef? A caterer? This is the whole ruckus about this guy who's, what is he already? He's nothing. He's runs an inn. So sorry about that. So they're mystified. So the Torah says that the angels look at Avram and they go, where is your wife Sarah? So the commentaries ask, what do you mean? They didn't know that his wife was preparing? Why did they ask him, where's your wife Sarah? And they're angels. They know where everybody is. The answer is, based on Hasidus, Jewish mysticism, and the Kabbalistic insight to this is, they weren't asking, where is she physically? They were saying to themselves, if Abraham is not who we thought he was probably the wife, Sarah, she's the great one. She's going to come out and we're going to see that mystical, magical, spiritual, holy woman. So they say, where is Sarah? And when Sarah comes out, the same reaction. That's Sarah? She's coming out with a platter of challah? And then, that moment, they realize something so important, so pivotal, which is one of the fundamental principles of our lives. They realize that holiness, true spirituality, true godliness, does not lie in someone sitting in a halo of holy light, studying all day. I don't have time for you. I'm a scholar. I'm a pious person. I can't be connected to you. True piety, true holiness, true connectivity to the spiritual soul that we all possess to God is, yes, cooking a meal for somebody, serving somebody a hot cup of coffee and listening to them, living in the real world, imbuing the world with light, goodness, godless hospitality, and kindness. Because the people who walk around with the halos are not the people who connect, are not the people who impact other people. The strength of Avram and Sarah was they weren't holier than thou. In the very mundane parts of life, they influenced people in a very positive way. Rashi says Abraham taught the men, Sarah taught the women. They chatted, they taught, they connected with people. That was their art, that was their skill set. And that's why they were so great. Not because they isolated themselves from the world and they said, yes, we discovered monotheism and we're going to now be writing our, what is it called? The dissertation? When you write a Dissertation. It was precisely their ability to relate to you, me, and every man, woman, and child who came across their path that made them great. And this is what the angels realized at that very moment. And then the passage says something very beautiful. That when they came into the tent, the passage says, Nitzavim alav, the angels were above Abraham and Sarah. But after they sat down, it says, Vihu omed aleihem. Avram and Sarah stood above them because they came in with the attitude, we're the angels. But after they realized who Avram and Sarah were, they met them, they realized now Avram and Sarah stood above them because they realized what the power of Avram and Sarah was. And this is the couple that starts off the Jewish people because look who they are. They're so relatable. They're so giving. They're so kind. And also true leaders of humanity, as we'll soon see. So now but does anybody have any questions or comments? So now the angels notify Avram and Sarah what? Guess what? You're 90. Diana, unmute so you could tell us.
They're gonna have a baby.
Mazel tov, Mazel tov. And Avram is 100 years old. She's 90. She's menopausal. And the angel says to Avram and Sarah, I have good news. God is going to give you a child. And then this is beautiful. This is what I call the Freudian. How do you know that we have the subconscious? Before Sigmund Freud wrote all of his theses and all of his books, it says that they tell Sarah that she's going to have a baby. They tell Avram and Sarah, and it says Vatsachaka bekirba. She laughed. Bekirba. Subconsciously, she laughed. She didn't go, oh, ha, 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 ha. Inside, she heard the news with disbelief. Because how do you know it was subconscious? Because Rashi asks, how does she laugh? And when later on, God says to her, why did you laugh when you got the news? And she said, I didn't laugh. Is she lying? She didn't realize she laughed. Inside, subconsciously, she had doubt. It's like when I tell you, Rochelle, you were going to win the Powerball, the 1.4 billion. You may not laugh outwardly, but inside you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to win it like a hole in the head. Good morning, Jane.
I have had you on the phone.
By the way, this is another proof how you know God wrote the Torah. How does God know it? How did we know that she subconsciously laughed? Which human being can analyze what's going on in your head? Only somebody who knows what people are thinking, Almighty God. So throughout the Torah, you have all these little proofs that this could not have been written by mankind. But anyway, another time. So she says, I didn't laugh, but subconsciously she doubted it. So this is another very beautiful insight. So God says to Abraham, your wife Sarah said that she's too old to have children, and she laughed. But what did Sarah really say? Sarah says to God, my husband's rich. So why did God switch it around? Why did God tell a white lie to Abraham? Why did God say to Abraham, your wife said with disbelief, she's too old to have a child. But that's not what she said. She said, I'm having a child. My husband is too old to have a child with me. And then the commentaries have a magnificent insight that the sanctity of marriage, the relationship of marriage is so powerful, so important, so vital to the world that God does not want to cause friction between Avram and Sarah. So to keep a marriage happy and hearty, you're allowed to tell a white lie. So what does God say to Abraham? Your wife said she's too old to have a child. God doesn't want Avram to say, what? My wife said I'm too old, she's too old. So to protect the harmony of marriage, you're allowed to tell a white lie. And you learn also that you never should badmouth a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. You should never say to a husband, yeah, you should set your wife straight. Or you shouldn't say to a wife, you should set your husband straight. You know what he told me the other day? The harmony of a marriage, shalom bayis, peace in the home, is so pivotal to life that we have to always do everything possible never to create friction between husband and wife. Never to create friction. Never tell a wife something about her husband or a husband something about her wife that will cause friction in the marriage. You know, we're not talking now about problems that are much more serious and deep-seated. We're talking generally speaking. Of course, if there's something dangerous, damaging, or hurtful, you have to think to yourself, should you be the one to tell? But in the meantime, you always have to think of the harmony of a marriage, because a marriage is the foundation of the universe. The home is the foundation of the universe. So they have a baby. And what do they call him? Who knows?
Isaac,
And in Hebrew,
Yitzchak.
Yitzchak. What does Yitzchak mean? Laughter.
Ah.
He brought joy and laughter, so they called him Yitzchak. It's interesting that the first Jewish baby is called laughter. Ha ha ha. You know, last year in the class, if you recall, I discussed why the first Jewish baby is called laughter. What kind of name is that to give a child, even though it's a beautiful name? So we're not going to go into that this time, but if anybody's interested and didn't remember last year, we can go into it a little bit later. So you notice that Yitzchak is born through a miracle because his mother is 90, she's post-childbirth age, his father is 100, so he's born through a miraculous occurrence. And he looks just like Abraham. He's the spitting image, because the commentaries say that no one should say that Sarah had a little something on, a little tete-a-tete in the background, because she wanted to have a child. Avram was old, so she went and she found herself somebody else. So he looks just like Abraham. He's the spitting image of his father, the commentaries tell us. So this is what happens with Yitzchak is born, Sarah and Abraham. And now we're going to segue into another story that comes to play, a very, very important story. But before we go into that story, is there anything that anybody wants to add or say? Like, I didn't address why we circumcise at 8 days. I didn't address why we circumcise at all. Why are women not circumcised? Why are only men circumcised? So I didn't address the whole circumcision topic because I did want to touch on now something that I felt is just a very beautiful, beautiful insight. So when we study Torah, I want to give this preface. There's an expression brought down, come into my garden. Come into my garden. Why does it called come into my garden? Because there's 4 ways to study the Torah. There's a garden in Hebrew called pardes. Pei Peshat. You read the book, you read the story, and what you read is what you understand. Then, that's Peshat, the simple story. Then Reish stands for Remez. Hints. How do we know that Sarah subconsciously laughed? Because it says, Atzachaka bikir ba, within her. What does it mean you laughed within her? Subconsciously. That's called a hint. Then there's Medrash, where you go even deeper, homiletics. And then the last way to study is Sod, the secrets of the Torah, what we call the Zohar, Kabbalah, and Jewish mysticism, Hasidus, which is based on Kabbalah. So if you notice throughout when we study together, I try to bring the 4 layers. First of all, there's some people that are very practical people. They're not mystical. Don't give me the mystical stuff. Don't give me the highfalutin stuff. Give me the practical story. And then there's some people that like to have a little excitement. You have Medrash, you have Remez. And then some of us love the Kabbalah, the mysticism, which really to me is the spice of Torah. And also, to me, that's the relevance to our living in 2022. How do we approach life? So I wanted to share this insight that we are going into the garden of Torah. We're going to approach it from all four directions. So now we come to a very, sorry, go ahead. Somebody wanted to ask something? So now we go to a very interesting, complicated story. Remember Lot, the nephew of Abraham? When Abraham left Haran, his nephew went along because his nephew said, I also want to believe in one God. But then there was a conflict of interests. Lot was not interested totally in following the path of his uncle. So Avram said to him, listen, you're not happy with the way we do things. Go your own way. And Lot says, you know what, Uncle Abraham? Okay. And he settles in one of the most expensive gated communities in that area called Sodom. There were 5 towns, 5 cities. The main city was Sodom. And Sodom was upper class people, elitist. Everyone has a helicopter pad. Everyone is in the highest tax bracket if they're paying taxes. It's a very elitist place to live. If you live in Sodom, you've come up into life. You're from what they say, creme de la creme. So Lot settles there, and he has 4 daughters. 2 of his daughters intermarry. In other words, in that days, remember, there was no intermarriage before the giving of the Torah, but 2 of his daughters marry Sodomites. And what was the concept of the Sodomites? What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. We may never share. You cannot have hospitality. We don't bring strangers in here. If a beggar knocks on the door, you kill him. And they were very cruel people, covered over, of course, in their sophistication, like the Nazis in Machshavim. They considered themselves very sophisticated, very aristocratic, but really they were immoral, horrible people. We're not going to go into all the terrible things they did. Now, Lot has become accepted by this society. Again, his 2 older daughters married 2 Sodomite men, and he is appointed Chief Justice of Sodom. So now he's a Supreme Court justice. He's a judge. And what is the straw that breaks the camel's back? Why does God suddenly decide, you know what, we're going to just annihilate Sodom and all these 4 other cities? There was a little girl in the community, and a poor man fell into Sodom somehow. He crossed the border, and he was starving, so she gave him bread. So they took her, they undressed her, they covered her with honey, and they put her under the beehives, and she died a very cruel death. And her tears, her cries were so horrible, so sad, so heartbreaking, that God said, no, I cannot allow this society to exist anymore. Sodom, I'm going to destroy them. But there is Abraham's nephew living there, Lot, and his wife and his children. And in the defense of Abraham, they will be saved. Abraham says to God, what? You're going to wipe out 5 towns? I'm telling you, there's righteous people there. God says, yeah, go find me the righteous. He wasn't even able to find 10 righteous people. And so the angels went into Sodom. They tell Lot and his wife and his children, come. There's going to be a terrible destruction here. Leave with us. The 2 oldest daughters and sons-in-law begin mocking Lot. You Jew, you the Abraham, you're from those Abraham people. We're not going with you. No one's destroying us. There's no God that you talk about. It's all Baba Mises. And there was one thing that God said to Lot and his family. Don't look back, no matter what. Remember that? Don't turn around. So now Lot, his 2 single daughters and his wife, whose name was Edith, are taken out of Sodom by the angels. And as they're leaving, there is a horrible destruction. Think of an atomic bomb goes off, and these 5 cities are totally demolished. At the last minute, Lot's wife turns around, and what happens to her? The famous story. Who knows?
She turns into a pillar of salt.
She turns into a pillar of salt. And people say that when you go to the Dead Sea, which is very salty, that there is a pillar there that looks like a woman. And that's who it is, Lot's wife. And that's maybe why the water is so salty. So now I have a bunch of questions for you. First of all, why can't you look back? Why can't you look back? What's the big deal you're looking back?
God said not to.
Okay, very good. But why? Why not? Next question I have for you. Why did she turn into a pillar of salt? Why didn't she just get burnt up? Hi, honey. Why didn't she just get burnt up with everyone else? What's the significance of salt? What kind of Bubba mice is this? Supernatural. So now we're going to go into the garden. You ready for the garden? So Pshat, the simple explanation, the commentaries who don't want to dig too deep, let's say, they said very interesting. When God brought this atomic explosion, it was like sulfur. So she turned into a sulfur statue. Salt is like sulfur. So if you don't want to get too complex with the salt story, we're going to just say it became a statue of sulfur. It was a remnant from this explosion, from this destruction. Okay. Why not look back? So one commentary says, because even though you're being saved, you don't want to revel in the destruction of people, even though they deserved it. We don't revel, we don't enjoy, we don't get any satisfaction from seeing 5 communities totally destroyed. It's no joy there. You might have been saved for good reasons, but you don't revel and you don't look back and say, see what's happening. And remember, they're only being saved because they're Abraham's nephew. They're not being saved because they're the most great people in the world. They're saved in the merit of Abraham. So it's not like you're so great. So please don't look back, because you could have been stuck there too. So that's a nice, right? That's a nice explanation, right? Don't look back. But there's something so beautiful I want to share, and that's the salt. What's salt? Everybody, what's salt? We need a little feedback here. Chani, you're a chef. What's salt? Chani's a gourmet chef. Chani, tell us about salt.
I'm not a gourmet chef, but without salt, you can't have life. I mean, everybody needs a certain amount of salt in their body, in their system. Without salt, there's no flavor in food. I mean,
excellent. And what happens if you oversalt the food?
I wouldn't know, because I never did that.
See, she's a gourmet. Okay, how many times did I oversalt the food? You could also kill the food, right? You could also kill your food if you oversalt, right? So salt
Salt is a balance, because too much salt, it's over. Too little salt, it has no flavor.
Very good. So salt, really, too much, terrible. Little bit, perfect, brings out the flavors of the food. Remember that when salt was such a commodity, remember in the olden days when we were talking about they found the root with the West Indies, and salt was such a commodity. So salt can enhance food. Salt can also destroy the food. There's a story of a very famous professor was coming to a home in the city. So the whole family that was going to host him was preparing all these foods and this delicious chicken soup. And everyone wanted to make sure that soup was perfect. So everybody added a little salt. The husband came in, reminds me of my house. My husband is always worried my soup doesn't have enough salt. I'm like, why is my soup so salty? Shia, did you add salt? He says, you never put enough salt. I'm like, now it's not edible anymore. So everyone added a little salt, and they come to the table, and they're giving out the bowls of soup. And the host, the guest, the scholarly guest, takes one spoonful and he begins to choke. It's a bowl of salt. Whereas the host at the other end of the table is just shoveling it away. So the host says to him, how come you're not eating the soup? He says, the question is not why I'm not eating. The question is, why are you eating it? It's so salty. So everybody wanted a salt. So salt in moderation is a very good thing. You overdo it, it's too much. Now the plot thickens. The Torah tells us something very interesting, that because she turned into a pillar of salt, when the Jews built the temple in Jerusalem and they brought the offerings, they had to sprinkle salt on the offerings. That was part of the service in the temple. And now when you, Shabbos, one of the custom is, when you cut the challah on Shabbat, you dip it in salt. You ever see people dunk the challah in the salt to remind us of the offerings in the temple? Let me ask you, is that really, God tells us to put salt on the offerings in the temple because she turned into a pillar of salt? That's a negative thing, her pillar of salt. It's not a positive thing. Why would we be putting salt on offerings in the temple or now on Shabbat on our challah because Lot's wife, Edith, turned into salt? Doesn't make sense. Usually you do a custom, a tradition, because it's a happy thing. It reminds us of good things. It reminds us of miracles. It reminds us of Bubby's latkes, whatever. So does anybody have an insight?
Well, we take 10 drops of wine out of our cups at Pesach. Maybe it's to remind us, even in happy times, there's something there.
Very good. Okay, those are the 10 plagues you talk about when we pour. It's interesting, but this year's Seder, my husband announced that everyone shouldn't use their pinky, they should pour. So everyone says, but Rabbi, the custom is to use the pinky. And my husband says, you know why the custom was to use the pinky? Because they were poor, they didn't have enough wine. So the pinky gave. But now we have a lot of wine. We're affluent. Jews are affluent, poor. Everybody pour the 10 plagues. Boy, were people pouring. Don't ask what was going on. We needed to bring out another case of wine. Which reminds me, just interesting tidbit. So I bought very beautiful wines. I want people come to the Seder, to the synagogue. They should have the most beautiful, expensive, dry, beautiful wine. So I'm walking around welcoming everyone, and a lady calls me over, Rabbitson. I'm like, yeah. She says, where's the Manischewitz? I said, Golda, Manischewitz is $2.99. It tastes like syrup. We brought the most expensive bottles of wine tonight, and you're looking for Manischewitz? She said, isn't it a tradition? I said, no, in those days, they only had Manischewitz. So anyway. So we're talking about what? Oh, we're talking about the salt. Okay, so it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic. I don't know. I get excited about everything. I'm sorry. So the thing is like this. So this, of course, is based on Kabbalah and Hasidus. Is God is telling us something very powerful. When he tells Lot and his family, don't look back. Remember, the Torah is not only telling us a story of what happened then. Everything in the Torah has to transcend centuries, generations, and come to modern life. That's the power of the Torah. That it's not only a story of yesteryear that we tell the children and it's so interesting. It's what is it relevance to us today? And remember, Abram and Sarah lived for a long time. We only have 4 or 5 stories about them. All the stories in the Torah are so short. Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. There was so much in their lives, yet we only have 2 little stories because the 5 books of the Moses are like what we call the Cliff Notes. You want to know the whole story, you need to go to the oral tradition, to the commentaries, the Medrash, like we said, the garden, because Cliff Notes are not going to give you the whole inside story. So the 5 books of Moses are teeny books. You want to know the whole story? You got to go out of the Cliff Notes, so to speak. So what's the story with the salt that God tells them, don't look back? And then she turns into salt because she does look back. You know, what's going on here in life, and I could so relate to it because I'm such a quintessential Jewish mother, is what's Jewish guilt? What's Jewish Alzheimer's? You remember everything but the guilt. And human nature is we're always feeling guilty. We have regrets. Why did I do this? I should have done that. And we kill ourselves, we beat ourselves up, and we live in the past. We're always looking back. And it holds us back in life when you look back. There's one thing having a conscience. There's one thing feeling guilty and learning to move forward from that guilt. I did the wrong thing. I'm never going to do that again. I feel so guilty I spoke that way. Or I feel so guilty I said that. Whatever guilt we have. And trust me, looking at the number one guilt in America. But, yes, but don't look back. You cannot spend your entire life stuck in the guilt cycle, in the depression cycle because of the guilt. You have to look forward. So when Lot's wife turns around and looks back, she turns into salt. She turns into salt. Salt in moderation, guilt in moderation, healthy guilt, healthy conscience. Excellent. Your life is you grow from guilt because sometimes your conscience says, you should have done that instead of that. And you learn from your mistakes. But let's say you get caught in a cycle, you're guilty, and you're even more depressed and more upset, and you can't get out of that. You're oversalting. Your life is become so filled with salt and guilt and regret and shame. You can't move forward. You're stuck in Sodom. You're stuck there. So God is telling Lot and his family, don't look back. Always look forward in life. We're all going to make mistakes. You're all going to do things that are not good. You're all going to everyone, thank God, has a conscience because that's what keeps us going. But don't get stuck in that cycle. It's destructive and it doesn't allow you to grow and live a life of happiness and joy and experience who you're meant to be. And that's why the offerings have salt, because carbon means closeness. When we brought offerings in the temple, we felt closer to God. When you give somebody a gift, my brother was dating a girl and she was perfect for him. I mean, if you see her, first of all, she's gorgeous externally, but she's kind, refined, everything you can want in a wife. And he couldn't get past, every time he would call me, well, I don't know. I'm like, stop it already, marry her. So my friend told him a very good advice. If you want to fall in love with someone, do something for them. Do something for them, and that will bring out love. So I called him up and I said, go bring her. She loved black and white cookies. Go bring her black and white cookies and coffee. Drop off a gift, drop off donuts. I don't know. And it brought out in him. It brought out in him the love. And thank God they're married with 7, 8 children, I think. I think 7 or 8, whatever. Can I know? So when we brought offerings to God, it brought us closer. Carbon means close. And that's why we put salt on it, because to remind us that there's a healthy level of guilt a person has to have in life, a healthy dose of guilt and conscience, but not overdoing it where it brings us to an abyss and you can't move on in life. You're so guilty. I'm so guilty. I'm a terrible mother. I'm a terrible wife. I'm a terrible boss. I'm a terrible this. I'm a terrible teacher. I'm a terrible whatever. And you're always beating yourself up. It pulls you away from life. So if salt brings you closer, enhances life, you need the salt. But if you see you're oversalting yourself, time to put a stop to it. So this is really what God is telling Lot. And a very interesting little tidbit also, as Lot, the husband of Edith, is leaving, it says, Hismamanta, he paused. he had doubts for a second that whether or not he should leave Sodom. After all, look at the great life I had there. So even he himself for a minute stopped in his tracks, but he didn't look back. But thank God he didn't look back, because he was saved together with his daughters. And she forever remained a pillar of salt. So this is the story of Sodom and what happens there. Does anybody have any questions or insights or complaints or contradictions or?
That was good.
So how did they know? How did they know she turned to salt without looking back at her?
That's-
But she next to-
Very good. How do you know she turned into a pillar of salt?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Unless
let's.
they look back.
Very good. Because they're not allowed to look back. How did they realize, right? Okay, so once they left Sodom, right, you're running across the field. Where's mommy? I don't know where mommy is. She disappeared. And after destruction, they saw that there was a pillar of salt.
Oh, they look back after.
Understand? They were running away, and suddenly mommy's not there anymore. What happened to her? Where is she? And that's what happened. It's a pillar of salt.
Wouldn't it have been really hard not to look back? You have your friends and people you live with, and
Yeah, it is very, very hard. It is
it's,
very.
you know, I'm thinking like salt is kind of cleansing, and it, you know, she kind of wanted to go back, but it was so bad and evil.
Another commentary says something very simple. You know why she turned into salt? If you don't want to get into the mystical or the philosophical is because remember the rule that they weren't allowed to have guests?
Yeah.
Now remember, Lot is the nephew of Abraham. She's not the nephew. She's married to Lot.
Oh, that's a
So
salt at the table.
she didn't want to tattle on her husband. So when the angels came, she didn't know in the beginning they were angels. When the angels came and said, we're rescuing you, she thought they're guests. Lot brought in guests. So she went to the neighbor's mansion. She said, Lucy, you have salt? I need some salt. She says, what do you mean? You don't have salt in it? She says, yeah, but I need more salt because there's people in my house. She tattled on her husband. So right before they're rescued, I didn't have time to tell every detail. The police of Sodom came to kill Lot and came to kill the guests. So the angels blinded the people. There's a whole story. There's a whole, interesting story. They blinded the people because they were angels. They had powers. So she turns into salt because she tattled on her husband with the salt. And another interesting tidbit that I remember learning as a little girl in yeshiva, they said that whenever guests came to Sodom, they withheld salt from the guests. They said, oh, you want food? We'll give you, but no salt. You get no salt. So because she withheld salt, she turned into salt. That's the story we were told in Cheder, what we call yeshiva. I laugh because, you learn the stories, and then when you start studying it for real, like, why didn't my teacher ever tell me that? Because it was too racy. My teacher didn't want us to know that.
They would have held our attention a little bit better, I think.
I know. Now when you teach kids, you actually tell them a little bit more of the meat and potatoes because you want to give them excitement in what they're studying. You want them to feel good, excited about it, So
I have kind of like a little complaint about that story.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I feel like I loved that explanation, the more mystical explanation. I think that's beautiful. But, she only looked back once. She wasn't dwelling on it. She wasn't, she didn't try and run back and keep looking. Like, she looked back once and then she's turned to salt. And I feel like the message that comes through with that story, what the message is to me is like, you don't listen to God, you're killed. Like, and that to me is fear-based, which is not at all how I think about God or how I want my kids to think about God. Sure, God loves you and is giving you a way to live that's for your highest good. But it shouldn't be done. I have to listen, or I'm going to turn into salt or die or whatever. If I make a mistake and I do something once, then it's over, So I think I love the explanation, but it's a big stretch for the actual story, the way it was told. And maybe there's more meat and potatoes around it, and I just don't remember it from when I was growing up.
That's a very beautiful question. So one thing I remember studying about this is right. What about second chances? But it's interesting that God did give Sodom. Remember when Abraham said, I want to find 50, and then he said, oh, can't find 50, I want to find 20. Edith, Lot's wife, was really meant to die with everybody in Sodom. She was not meant to be rescued with her husband and daughters. But God in his mercy said, you know what? She's Lot's wife. She's going to have an opportunity to be saved together with her husband and children. So she really deserved to perish in Sodom. So perhaps she turned into salt because she was given a chance not to turn around.
Wasn't grateful for it. Like, there was gratitude.
And I don't have every answer, by the way. You know what I mean? Perhaps I'm thinking now, she really deserved to die. She was meant to perish with the Sodomites. God said, you're going to be saved. The angels say, you're going to be saved. Don't look back. And she looked back. And only God knows what's in someone's heart. Perhaps her looking back was not so much, oh, wow. Her looking back was like, you know what?
Like
Go ahead.
she was maybe still there.
That may be right. Very good. Hani, say that again. That was very good.
I was saying maybe it's like she looked back longingly. And also I feel like she was she didn't really deserve to be saved based on all the stories. Like, who goes and tells on their husband that they have guests? Like, you know what I'm saying? This was her second chance or third chance or fourth chance. And I also feel that in a desperate situation, when you tell somebody, let's just say you're jumping out of a building because it's like burning or collapsing, and you say jump and they hesitate, they could die. So here she hesitated, they were running for their lives and she took a moment. So then it was too late. I don't know. This is just what I'm thinking.
And that insight also goes to that first commentator. I forgot who it was. There's a lot of commentators who said that it wasn't salt. She got burnt with the sulfur because she turned around. So she got caught in the explosion. I call it an explosion, but she got caught in the destruction. So she actually didn't turn into salt. She turned into the sulfur, like she was covered in some kind of, she died covered in this, she got burnt alive, whatever, covered in the sulfur. So in that case, her turning around killed her. If you want to take what we said from the garden, the explanation of why it happened to her. But
I like that because I didn't fully know the whole story. Like if this was like, the eighth chance already, like she didn't deserve it. And you hesitate. I think there's a lesson in, following following it when, to what you said, like when it's do or die, you got to go, you've got to follow, you really need to move quickly and swiftly. I think that's a beautiful lesson. Like sometimes, there isn't a chance to look back. Like you just need to move forward in those circumstances.
Khani, that was beautiful. Thank you, Khani.
But when you're burying someone, it's like when you're burying someone, she's burying all the people she knows, and maybe she is longing because she didn't sound that lovely. But when you go to a funeral and you take one last look to say goodbye.
Yeah.
That's kind of, but maybe that's not, maybe she was looking back like, oh, should I really go? That could be a lot of things happening there.
Well, Lot, there's so many details. I wanted to touch on one more thing, but that's why when you read the Torah portion about this in the synagogue, it's called a shalshelet. You might notice it where the reader of the Torah goes, and it's called doubt, ambivalence in Judaism. by the part where it says that Lot hesitated, it's read with this tune to show us that there was a moment of ambivalence. You ever heard of cognitive dissonance from that guy first, Dr. Fursinger? So they say this was the first example of cognitive dissonance, where Lot is detached from the reality. He wants to stay, but yet he has to go because look what's going on. There's a destruction. There's a whole catastrophe happening here. So maybe this was the first example of disassociation and ambivalence. So, and that's why you have the shalshelet, which is cognitive cognitive dissonance. Did I say right, Shelley? Professor Shelley. Okay.
You're just perfect.
Okay, thank you. So, when Uber first came out, I would call it Uber, and my kids would go, Ma, Uber, and I'm like, I'm sorry. And also let me tell you, I always say this, I'll say it one more time. God wrote the Torah. God could have doctored the stories, not to make people look bad, as we'll soon read different stories that are very controversial. And maybe don't make people look that great, but the reason they're in the Torah is because they're there for us. There's something to be learned. There's something to be taught. There's something to be had. Because like I mentioned, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that we read, are shorter than Herman Wouk's Wind of War, and Harry Potter and all those, the same examples I give every single boring time. So you have to say that the oral tradition is necessary to analyze the story because the stories are sometimes so painful and like you wonder. And I know our time is up, but if you give me 2 more minutes, I want to end off with the quick explanation of what happens with the Akedah. But if you rather we close the class, we can. So Akedas Yitzchak is even a more, to me, painful story, where God tells Abraham to take his one and only son with Sarah, his beloved son, and bring him as an offering on the place where I will show you. This is the Akedas Yitzchak, with the binding of Isaac, is one of the most controversial and to me sad stories. They finally have a child, right? He's 100 years old. His wife is 90. 38 years later, Yitzchak is now 38 years old. And God comes to Abraham and says to him the most ludicrous, ridiculous, heart-wrenching thing. Take your son, and if you're wondering which son, the one that you had with Sarah, your beloved son, the one you love most, and bring him as an offering to the place, the mountain I will show you. Now what happens? Avram doesn't have even a conversation with God. I would say okay, God, you finally gave me a son, right? You told me my children, my future generation from this son will be as many as the stars in the sky, the sand on the beach, right? You promised me this. And now you're telling me to take my son and bring him for an offering? I'll do it, God, because I'm Avraham, but tell me why. Or maybe I didn't hear you right. Avram doesn't say a word. You wonder about this. Put up a little resistance. He gets up early in the morning, takes his son, who's 38 years old, by the way. He's no little baby boy. You think he's taking him in the baby carriage. The kid doesn't know what's happening. Yitzhak, come, we're going. And God uses the same terminology as back then when he leaves Haran. Remember, he says, Lech lecha, go for you, for your benefit. He tells him again, Lech lecha, go for you, to a mountain I will show you. Again, he doesn't give him the destination. The same innuendo as before. So Avram takes a knife, he takes wood, and takes his son. They saddle up a donkey and they go. And now the plot is even more intense because human sacrifice is the antithesis of Torah and godliness. In that generation, remember the pagans, if there was a famine, they would sacrifice their children. If they felt the gods were angry, they didn't win the war, they would sacrifice their people. Remember that the pagans would sacrifice human sacrifice. the total antithesis of God, Torah, humanity, morality. Human life is the up here in the. You're allowed to desecrate Shabbos. You're allowed to do anything to save a human life. That's how valuable human life is. How could God ask Abraham, who's now a celebrity? Everybody knows Abraham. He's one of the wealthiest people in the world and societies, on the front page of People magazine. Abraham, go take your child and bring him as a sacrifice, human sacrifice. Desecration of God's name. God is telling him to bring human sacrifice? The antithesis of everything Abraham has been teaching society. One God, sanctity of life. You matter. Birth means you matter. God put you here for a reason. How could he ask him to do that? Insane. And he goes. And he doesn't say anything. And then even one more thing I want to point out. The first time the word love is used in the Torah is this line, where God tells him to take the son who you love. The word love is not used yet. When Adam spots his wife and it's love at first sight, doesn't say the word love. Doesn't say when Abraham met Sarah, he fell in love. This is the first time God uses the word love. Now, you're telling somebody to go sacrifice their child. Why do you have to stick the knife in the heart and say, and you know, that not only the child you love, the child you adore? Why do that? Say, take your son, minimize the pain that this is the son he loves so deeply, so profoundly, that he waited so many years for. Why do you have to tell him the son you love so deeply? That's cruel. It really is. Okay, did we paint a good argument here? So now they go. I have to say the story so we know. And in the middle of the hike, whatever you want to call it, Yitzhak turns to his father and he says, "Dad." And his father says, "Yes, my son." He said, "I see the wood, I see the knife, but I don't see any offerings. You have a little sheep somewhere, you have a little lamb, you have a little goat." So what does Avram tell his son? Anybody want to fill in the blanks?
You're the sacrifice.
Exactly. He says to him, "Yes, my son." He says, "It is God who will see to the sheep for this burnt offering, my son." Which means you, my son, are the burnt offering. Then, so in other words, he tells his son right away, "You're my burnt offering." So what do you expect Yitzchak to do now? They're on the way to the mountain. Yitzchak says, "Dad, like, what's going on here?" He's getting suspicious now. "Where is the offering?" And he says, "You, my son, are the offering." So now what do you expect Yitzchak to do? He's 38 years old.
Amy?
What? Who said run?
Yeah, you expect
Shelley
it.
said run? Yeah, run for the high. I would run away. My father's crazy. He has a moment of insanity. God told you, he didn't tell me. But
Right.
this is
Exactly.
what happens. And the two of them walked on together. And Rashi says, what does it mean they walked together with one heart? In other words, okay, you told me I'm the offering. We're going to go. We're going to do it. This right away tells you who Yitzchak is also. Now you know why he's the next patriarch. Because he could have run. He could say, "God, you know, God told you, Mom, you had a dream. God told you a vision. Good for you. I'm not going to be crazy like you."
Right.
Right? So they come. He binds him up. He says, "Dad, tie me tight because I don't want to, I don't want to flinch." And as he takes the knife and he's about to harm his son, an angel swoops down and pushes his hand away and says, "No, Avram, God does not want you to sacrifice your son." And he goes, he sees a ram, he brings the ram, and that's why we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah with a ram, to remember how Abram was willing to give up everything for God. Everything. And Now, as we pray for the high holidays, God, forgive us in the merit of Abraham, because remember, he's our father. He was willing to give up everything for you. Now you step up for us. This is the end of the story. And when Yitzhak gets older, he becomes blind. Remember that? He becomes blinded. Why? Because when the angels saw Yitzhak lying on that pile of rocks, bound, they began to cry. They couldn't believe that God is going to sacrifice the descendant of Abraham. They cried. So the tears flew into his eyes, the commentaries, the Medrash tells us, and it blinded him. Their tears were so powerful. So later on in life, he developed an eye where he couldn't see. The tears of the angels. So there's so much of the story. I'm going to try to condense because time is running out. But one thing comes clear, that the society realized that God does not want human sacrifice. So this was a declaration that human sacrifice is abhorred by Almighty God. But what happened over here? What went on over here? What went on here is many, many things. One is that, remember last week we discussed how whatever the patriarchs and matriarchs did, cut through the jungle, made the path, built the bridge for future generations. When Abraham unquestionably said, without any question, went and did God's will, he broke every barrier, every wall of self-sacrifice. So that when future generations, future Jews had to walk into a concentration, into a crematorium, or during the Spanish Inquisition, where they burnt them alive, and a Jew got up and said, listen, I will not convert. I am a Jew. I will always be a Jew. Do what you want. I'm a Jew. Every generation where Jews died because they were Jewish and sacrificed themselves for their Judaism came because Abraham, centuries ago, was asked by God to bring his son as an offering, didn't question, didn't protest, and went and was willing to do what God said, only for one reason, because God said it. Understanding that God is infinite. We don't understand God's way. We'll never understand God's way. If God tells me to do something, Abraham says, I'm going to do it because God said so. So when he took his son, sacrificing his entire future, his past, his present, his future, because there would be no descendants if Yitzhak would die. Abraham created a spiritual pathway for self-sacrifice for all generations. So when a Jew stood up to the Crusaders and said, you could kill me, but I will not give up my Judaism. I will not bow down to the idol. When Hannah, 7 sons, remember that horrific story, her 7 sons are slaughtered by the king because they don't want to bow down to the idol. It is because Abraham created the path that we should have the energy that when needed, we can profess self-sacrifice for who we are. And thank God we're living in America today. We don't have those challenges. So that paved the way for the self-sacrifice. But you might say, Yitzhak lived. So with self-sacrifice, it wasn't really self-sacrifice. The guy who went into the crematorium, he died. Yitzhak didn't die, right? Yet, the reason Avram is the one that paves the way is because future self-sacrifice have not, I don't want to say this, and please bear with me, it's not a negative term, but when a Jew is given a choice, convert or die, declare, announce your Judaism or die, and you say, I'm going to die, it's not that there's ego, but there is something there. They're given a choice. It's self-serving, but in a very positive way. And I hesitate to use the word self-serving. I don't mean self-serving that, oh, it's egotistical, but there is a person present there. There's an ego present. I will not give up my Judaism for Christianity. You can burn me alive. And they burn him alive, like Rabbi Akiva. Remember? He said, I will not renounce my faith, and they killed him. Abraham had no ulterior. There was nothing there. There was nothing there. His self-sacrifice was the ultimate because there was no, he wasn't given a choice. Kill Yitzhak or I'll kill you. That's not what God said. God said, bring your son. So he created self-sacrifice of the highest level so that in future generations, when somebody needed that energy, it was there for them. That's one thing. The second thing, and I'll leave it off with this. Why does God say, the son who you love? Because God is saying to Avram, you love your son, but you know what? I love him too. It's not, I don't love your son, so I want you to bring him. I love him too. So till this happened, Avram loved his son on a finite level of love. But after he was willing to sacrifice his son, the love now became boundless, infinite, because it was tied to God's love. It was a love that now went above and beyond anything it could be. And that's what happened here. Before, love was love. He loved his son, but now he developed an infinite love. And I want to explain it with a story, and I'm going to end with the story. There was a very famous philosopher. He's a rabbi. He's a scholar. He's refined. He's beloved. He has students. He's a magnificent person. And he has a son who is, I have to say, a derelict. The kid is into drugs. The young man is into alcohol. He's promiscuous. He's the antithesis of his father. And his father told a story. His father said his son came to him one day. He told this privately. He didn't give it in a lecture. And he said, Dad, I want you to know one thing, and hear me out. I will never believe in the God you believe in. I will never do what you do. I will never follow your morals, your ethics, your religion. Just know that. Accept it, that I will never, ever want to be who you are. And the father was like, imagine a son saying this to his father. And his father says to him the following thing. He says to his father, I want you to know this, my dear son, he said. It is because of my relationship with God that my love for you is boundless and infinite. I will love you forever. And the son looked at his father and he was in shock. He said, Dad, I want to thank you for telling me that. And I don't have the end of the story. I don't have the miracle story. And now the son is a perfect guy in a white tucked-in shirt, blue collar, working in a hedge fund. I don't have that story. But again, what did the father say? Because of my relationship with God, that's why my love for you can be boundless and infinite. And that is the story here. When Avram didn't question God, when God said, your son who you love, I also love him. I created him. I gave him to you. Bring him for an offering. Do what I tell you. Because once Avram didn't question, and he went without questioning, and his son went along with him, that's when the love became the finite love of a father to a son to the infinite love. Because it broke down a barrier that allowed this infinite love to come. By connecting to God, unquestionable Avram, he really created an infinite connection to the love for his son. So it's all connected. It's not like, I love God, but I don't have time for you, kinderlach. I'm busy praying, I'm busy swaying. I don't have time for my family. Or the people who only have time. I don't have time for you, God. I'm a busy person. I'm a mother. I have 11 children. I have to cook. I work. I have a job. It's connected. The infinite love you have for your children is because you're connected to something like God. Whatever you want to call God. You want to call God. You want to call God creator. You want to call God that thing. Whatever you want to call God. You don't have to use the word God. That is what it is. And that's what happened here. There was a whole metamorphosis happening. And Avram and Sarah allow this to happen. And the sad ending of this, and it breaks my heart every time I read the Torah, is that Sarah does not know that her son was saved. She hears that her son has been sacrificed and she passes away. So when Avram and Yitzhak come back, so happy and relieved, what do they come back to? That Sarah has passed away. So life is not always easy. Life, it's not like Avram, it must have been so easy for him. No, it wasn't easy for him. Look, he comes back and his love of his life, his wife, his partner, his Rebbitzin, whatever you want to call her, gone. So life is challenging, and the Torah talks to us about challenging because it's real life. The Torah wants to show us this is real life. It's not always a walk in the park, even for the matriarchs and the patriarchs, especially for the matriarchs and the patriarchs. So again, to sum up, when you are connected to something infinite, that gives you infinity, that allows you to be the best version of yourself. So now you know, you love your children, you know why. Like my kids, when I would take them shopping, they would hide, and I would think I lost a child, and my heart fell. That is the love of a child. That is the love of a child. So we're going to end with this Torah portion. And I want to